General Hospital spoilers teased that Brit's return to Port Charles was never going to be simple. But no one could have anticipated just how deeply her reappearance would shake the foundations of families who thought their secrets had been buried for good. The mere whisper of her name sent ripples through the Quartermain estate and echoed like a ghost down the halls of General Hospital. For years, the truth about Rocco's origins had been tightly contained, wrapped in layers of deception and forgotten pain. But now, as Brit emerged from the shadows of presumed death, what had been hidden was clawing its way back to the surface, threatening to consume not only Lulu and Dante's fragile truce but also Rocco's entire sense of identity. What had once been a historical footnote, one more twisted page in the annals of Windmere and the Albrecht Westbourne legacy, was suddenly a living, breathing storm. And Brit stood at its eye. Not just as the catalyst for chaos but as its very embodiment. The news of her survival had arrived like a spark in dry brush. No one expected it, and yet, the moment it landed, the landscape began to burn. Whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs to confrontation. Rocco, who had been quietly navigating the growing tension between Lulu and Brooklyn, stumbled upon the sealed folder Brooke had been hiding, an innocuous envelope that held within it an earthquake's worth of truth. He wasn't meant to see it. But he did. And in that moment, his life split in two, the version he'd known, and the version now unraveling before him. Inside the folder was a birth certificate, but not the one he'd known growing up. This one bore a different name, Benjamin Westbourne. But more haunting than the name was the accompanying documentation, photos of Brit during her pregnancy, medical forms signed by Liesl, and a DNA match buried in legal jargon. It was enough to fracture his sense of self. Questions surged like a flood, none with immediate answers. Why had no one told him? Why did his life begin with a lie? And most terrifyingly, who really was he? Brooklyn, flustered and cornered, tried to backpedal, insisting that she hadn't meant for him to see it. That it wasn't her secret to tell. But her guilt hung thick in the room, and her silence only further confirmed the gravity of what Rocco had just uncovered. His eyes narrowed. Not in anger, but in the stunned realization that everything he thought he knew had been curated, shaped, and filtered by the very people he trusted most. The confrontation with Lulu came swift and merciless. Rocco burst into her home with the envelope clutched in his shaking hands, his voice echoing through the walls, demanding the truth. Lulu, blindsided, tried to gather herself, but the damage had already begun. There was no gentle way to tell your child that the mother he'd clung to since infancy wasn't the one who carried him in the womb. There was no balm for a truth like that. She explained, haltingly. Painfully, that Brit had stolen a fertilized embryo, implanted it in herself with Liesl's help, and posed as Rocco's mother until the ruse was finally shattered. The baby, their baby, had been kidnapped before he was even born. What should have been a victory, his return, was now laced with the poison of betrayal. Rocco reeled. He couldn't look at her the same way. It wasn't that he stopped loving her, but something cracked open inside him that refused to close. He didn't know whether to mourn the lie or the reality it concealed. And then, another thought began to haunt him. If Brit was his biological mother by gestation, did that make her his mother in a real, physical sense? Did that change who he was at the cellular level? If so, what did it mean that she had returned now? Because Brit's return wasn't just a curiosity. It was a seismic event. Brit wasn't just a woman with a checkered past. She was the holder of truths no one wanted aired. Her mere presence upended the delicate balance that so many in Port Charles had worked to maintain. Dante, who had spent years trying to rebuild trust with Rocco, now found himself in the crosshairs of his son's resentment. Brit, despite her past misdeeds, now seemed like the only person who might be able to explain what had happened in a way that didn't feel filtered or sanitized. Her voice carried the weight of the trauma. Her return was Rocco's opportunity to confront not just the truth, but the woman who had carried him, deceived his parents, and vanished. And Brit wasn't returning quietly. She came back not as a ghost, but as a storm, unapologetic and brimming with complications. She hadn't returned out of guilt or longing. No, she had returned because the truth refused to stay buried. And she was tired of hiding from it. But even she didn't anticipate the emotional carnage her reappearance would cause. Rocco, now consumed by the need for answers, sought her out, uninvited and full of fury. Their meeting was laced with electricity, 1,000 questions barely contained behind his trembling lips. Britt looked at him with something close to awe. He had grown into a young man with fire in his eyes, the same fire she once tried to manipulate for her own redemption. Their encounter didn't end in resolution. It ended in fracture. Rocco stormed out, but not before telling her that he didn't know if he could forgive any of them, not her, not Lulu, not Dante, not even Brooke. Meanwhile, Brooke was facing her own reckoning. Lulu unleashed her fury, accusing Brooke of sabotaging the family's fragile healing by holding on to secrets she had no business possessing. But Brooke shot back with a brutal truth. If Lulu and Dante had been honest from the start, she never would have needed to hide anything. The fight wasn't just about betrayal. It was about control, who had the right to protect the truth. And who had the right to reveal it. But the chaos didn't stop there. The resurgence of Britt also reignited tensions between Jason and others close to the case. The lines between ally and adversary blurred quickly. Jason, who had once been romantically entangled with Britt, now found himself questioning her motives. Was she truly back to right old wrongs, or did she have another agenda entirely? As the days unfolded, Rocco began to spiral. His school performance dropped, his behavior grew erratic. And his bond with Dante all but disintegrated. He found solace in the most unexpected place, Geo. The two boys, both grappling with courtermain chaos and complicated parentage, forged a bond rooted in mutual confusion. Geo, who had recently discovered he was the biological son of Brooke and Dante, understood all too well what it meant to live in the shadow of someone else's choices. Together, they vented, conspired, and plotted small acts of rebellion. Not out of cruelty but out of a desperate need to reclaim autonomy over their lives. Rocco even toyed with the idea of going to court, petitioning for legal emancipation or demanding a DNA test to prove who he was once and for all. The irony, of course, was that the more he sought answers, the less he recognized himself. Back at General Hospital, Britt began to feel the weight of her decision to return. She never expected to be welcomed with open arms, but she hadn't braced for the hostility either. Sasha, newly recovered from her own trauma, warned Britt to tread lightly. Michael, already reeling from Nina's betrayals and Willow's unraveling loyalty, saw Britt's return as one more threat to the stability he was trying to restore for Wiley, Amelia, and now Daisy. And through it all, Britt remained a paradox. She wasn't innocent. She wasn't evil. She was a woman who had made unforgivable choices, and yet she had the potential to be the key that unlocked years of confusion for a boy on the brink of collapse. Whether she would choose to take responsibility or retreat into self-preservation remained to be seen. But one thing was clear, the past had found its way into the present. And no one was walking away unscathed. Rocco's sense of betrayal festered, Britt's return turned into a cultural tremor in Port Charles, and the fallout was just beginning. For in soap operas as in life, the truth doesn't set you free, it demands to be reckoned with. And in the case of Britt, Lulu, Dante, and Rocco, the reckoning had only just begun. Rocco was no longer the quiet, composed young man who once looked up to his parents with blind trust. That version of him was gone, shattered beneath the weight of betrayal he never saw coming. What had begun as a normal day unraveled into a storm of revelations he could no longer ignore. The name Britt now haunted every corner of his mind. Not as a distant figure from his past but as a glaring truth he had been denied. With every passing hour, his anger deepened, not just toward Britt, but toward Dante and Lulu. The two people who had built his world on what he now realized were lies. And as the shock settled into his bones, a dangerous obsession began to take root. The need for the truth. The need for justice, and the need to reclaim the identity he believed was stolen from him. The more Rocco thought about it, the more enraged he became. His entire life had been dictated by choices made behind closed doors, by decisions that shaped who he was without his consent. The idea that Lulu had known the truth all along, that Dante had helped maintain the facade, drove him to the brink. Every memory, every bedtime story, every moment of supposed truth now reeked of manipulation. How could they smile at him, love him, support him, knowing that the most fundamental piece of who he was had been hidden from him? And it wasn't just personal betrayal. This wasn't just a rift between a son and his parents. It was something far more explosive. What Rocco uncovered threatened to dismantle the very structure of Dante and Lulu's parental rights. With Britt's return and the proof in Brooklyn's files, the legal foundation of Rocco's custody was at risk. Though the law had once corrected the injustice Britt committed by returning Rocco to Lulu and Dante, a new legal storm was forming, one based not just on past crimes, but on years of concealment. If brought into a courtroom, Rocco's revelations could ignite a custody battle that could cost Dante and Lulu everything. And Rocco knew it. That was the most dangerous part. The anger brewing inside him wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. He began collecting evidence, recording conversations, pulling hospital records, and seeking guidance from anyone who would listen. He didn't care about consequences anymore. What mattered was making sure Dante and Lulu felt the same betrayal, the same helplessness, the same sense of powerlessness that had consumed him since the moment he discovered the truth. This wasn't revenge, it was retribution. And in Rocco's eyes, it was long overdue. What no one expected was how rapidly things would spiral. As the truth circulated, quietly at first, then with growing momentum, support for Dante and Lulu began to crumble. Family members who had once defended their actions now questioned their silence. Friends who had stood by them now whispered in corners, wondering what else they had hidden. The community was beginning to fracture, and at its center was a young man who refused to be silenced. Rocco's obsession became public when he filed a petition with family court demanding a reevaluation of custody, naming Britt as a gestational parent with a right to involvement. The filing was a bombshell. The judge, stunned by the depth of the claim, ordered a hearing. Suddenly, Dante and Lulu weren't just dealing with a rebellious son, they were fighting a legal war with consequences that could shatter their lives. The guardianship they had taken for granted was under siege. And Britt, for her part, didn't run. In a surprising twist, she agreed to testify, on Rocco's behalf. She didn't seek custody, nor did she demand rights. But she confirmed the medical records, the deception, and the timeline. She admitted her guilt but made it clear that Rocco deserved the truth. Her testimony didn't just validate Rocco's claims, it exposed the extent to which Dante and Lulu had covered it up. And the court took notice. The fallout was immediate. Emergency hearings were scheduled. Media attention exploded. Rumors spread through the hospital like wildfire. And amid the chaos, Dante and Lulu began to realize they were losing everything. Rocco refused to live with them. He refused to speak with them. He moved into the Quartermain estate temporarily, under Michael's watch, citing emotional trauma. A court-appointed psychologist began evaluating him for long-term placement options. And worse still, family services began investigating Dante and Lulu's past handling of the situation. The pressure was unbearable. Dante, once a symbol of moral integrity in Port Charles, now faced disciplinary review within the police department for potentially falsifying custody documentation years ago. Lulu's position in various community foundations was suspended pending further inquiry. Their reputations, once sterling, were now in ruins. And yet, Rocco felt no peace. Because despite everything he'd exposed, the ache remained. The identity crisis that had begun with a folder of paperwork had now consumed his entire world. He wasn't Britt's son. He wasn't Lulu's son. He wasn't sure who he belonged to anymore. And the truth that was supposed to set him free had left him more fractured than ever. What made it worse was the growing sense that Britt wasn't done. Her return hadn't been random. Whispers suggested she'd been tipped off, by someone within the hospital or perhaps by Brooke herself. And though she maintained that she only wanted to make amends, the timing was too perfect, the unraveling too precise. Rocco couldn't shake the feeling that there was still another layer. Another lie waiting to collapse. And if that lie implicated even more people, like Liesel, or Albrecht's allies within WSB, it could spark a chain reaction Port Charles wouldn't survive. Rocco's world, once held together by the illusion of stability, was now burning. And he stood in the middle of the fire with one goal, to make sure no one who lied to him walked away unscathed. As Dante and Lulu watched everything they'd built begin to crumble, they realized the one thing they could no longer control was the truth. And for once, Rocco was holding all the power. Rocco's anger had burned through the lies, and now in the smoldering aftermath, something unexpected was beginning to take shape, a fragile thread of curiosity that pulled him toward the one person he had been taught to resent, Britt. The woman who had carried him in secret. The woman who had once tried to pass him off as her own in a desperate attempt to keep another man, the woman who had disappeared from his life like a shadow. And yet, despite everything, Rocco found himself unable to ignore the echo of her name in every corner of his mind. The paperwork, the photos, the awkward silences from Lulu, all of it had led him here. To a woman whose existence had been both erased and weaponized. And he was done living inside the lies that others had built for him. The first meeting wasn't warm. It wasn't comfortable. Britt had changed since her time in Port Charles. Hardened by exile, softened by regret, but still brilliant, still calculating, and still tethered to her past in a way she had never truly escaped. When Rocco arrived at her doorstep, the tension between them was electric, a storm built on what could have been, what should have been, and what had been stolen from both of them. Britt didn't cry. And Rocco didn't yell. They just looked at each other for a long time, two people trying to recognize what should have been instinctual. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both knew. This was the moment their story began again. Their connection reignited something dangerous in the town. As word spread that Rocco was spending time with Britt, it sent shockwaves through the already fractured relationships in Port Charles. Lulu was livid. Dante was helpless. The Quartermains were split. Some sympathized with the boy's right to explore the truth, while others feared what Britt's return meant for their already fragile peace. And worst of all, Liesel, always a lurking force in Britt's orbit, began to stir again, sensing that her daughter's re-entry into Rocco's life could be used for far more than redemption. But for Rocco, this wasn't about sides. It was about identity. About ownership of a past that had always been denied to him. Every moment with Britt felt like uncovering a secret language he was born to speak. Her humor, her cynicism, her defiance of rules, they mirrored so many pieces of himself he'd never been able to name. It terrified him and comforted him at the same time. And for Britt, seeing Rocco up close, his fire, his questions, his hurt, reminded her of everything she had tried to bury. She didn't expect forgiveness, but what she gave him was something no one else could. Unfiltered honesty. Britt told him the whole story, the embryo theft, her role, her guilt, the betrayal of both Lulu and Dante. The desperate hope to create a family of her own in the ashes of rejection. She didn't sugarcoat any of it. She owned it. And Rocco, who had heard only versions of the truth before, finally felt like someone was speaking to him like an adult. Not as a child who needed to be shielded. Not as a pawn in a war between his parents, but as a young man capable of deciding what his history meant to him. This newfound bond became an obsession. Rocco spent more time with Britt than anyone expected. They walked the waterfront, pored over medical records, and even laughed, tentatively at first, then with ease. It was strange, even surreal. But it felt real. It felt earned. And that made it dangerous. Because Port Charles was not ready for a version of Rocco who no longer clung to the illusion of Dante and Lulu's heroism. This was a Rocco who asked questions publicly, who posted on social media about family deception, who hinted at legal action again, not just for the past, but for medical negligence. psychological harm, and even fraud. His growing alliance with Britt opened doors to long-sealed files, hidden lab records, and confidential adoption disputes. The town began to buzz. Rumors grew louder. Was Britt trying to reclaim custody? Was Liesel involved in manipulating Rocco's newfound independence? Was someone, possibly Lulu herself, trying to block their meetings behind the scenes? Every attempt to stop the connection only made it stronger. Because in Rocco's eyes, the resistance was proof of the truth. If they were trying this hard to silence him, it meant they were afraid. And that fear became fuel. He confronted Lulu again, this time not with anger, but with precision. He brought photos of Britt holding him in the early days. He cited medical journals. He demanded to know why the name, Westbourne, was erased from his records. Lulu broke down, begging him to understand that it wasn't about lies, it was about protection. But to Rocco, protection had always felt like a cage. And now that he had tasted freedom, he wasn't going back. Meanwhile, Britt found herself drawn deeper into a storyline she never meant to return to. She had only wanted to make peace with the past. But with each passing day, Rocco's needs pulled her further from neutrality. She started fighting for his right to autonomy, challenging hospital boards, defending him in public, and warning Dante and Lulu to back off. Her presence reignited old feuds, dredged up ancient scandals, and exposed just how fragile the town's power dynamics had become. And still, the emotional temperature kept rising. Rocco's need for truth evolved into something more complex, an obsession with rewriting his legacy. He wasn't just exploring who he was anymore. He was determined to reshape the narrative. And Britt, despite all her flaws, was the only person not trying to stop him. But obsessions have consequences. Dante, desperate to regain his son's trust, began making uncharacteristically dangerous moves. He broke into Britt's apartment, looking for documents. Lulu followed Rocco to clandestine meetings and tried to intercept him. Liesel, sensing chaos, began recruiting allies to protect Britt, and by extension, Rocco. The town that once whispered about scandals behind closed doors now found itself on the verge of public collapse. And through it all, Rocco stood taller. Not because he was right. Not because he was whole. But because for the first time in his life, he had chosen his path. Whether that path led to healing or destruction no longer mattered. What mattered was that it was his. And if embracing Britt meant breaking free from a past built on silence and manipulation, then so be it. Because sometimes, the only way to find yourself, is to burn everything else down.